So when was it that you knew that radio was going to be your profession?
At the ripe old age of 7, I
Radio, really, at 7?
yeah, yeah. Growing up, and I was born in New Jersey, and my early years, we lived in a town, Wayne, New Jersey, and I remember there was a radio station, WABC. It was on the AM dial. It was just a blowtorch of a radio station, and probably the most popular radio station in the country at the time. And it was around the time that the Beatles were big, and I just would listen on this little transistor radio on the school bus all the way to school and all the way home. And I actually would even sneak the radio, the little transistor. I slept in the bottom bunk of bunk beds, and my older brother slept on the top bunk, and I would put the radio in the slats above me. And as soon as I knew he was asleep, I'd grab the radio and put it next to my ear and listen to Cousin Brucey on WABC and his show at night. And I was just mesmerized by it, and I love music, and I just, from that point on, I always wanted to be in the business. And I got my opportunity when I went to Fairfield University. First day of freshman year, they had an orientation for all the clubs, and one of the clubs there was the college radio station, and they were desperate in need of students to operate it. So I signed up, and I'll never forget, I signed the list. The next day in my mailbox was a notice saying to come to a meeting. I went to the meeting 2 days later, and in less than a week, I was on the air doing the news. And 4 years later, I was the general manager of the radio station, and graduated, and didn't have the guts to tell my father that after all the money he spent on my tuition that I wanted to be a DJ. So I took a job. I was recruited off campus by a defense contractor in Schenectady. And by this time, not obviously, but by this time we had moved up to Lenox. We moved to Lenox when I was just before my sophomore year of high school. And there was a gentleman who lived down the street from us. His name was Dick Jackson, and Dick owned WBEC, AM and FM. And I got home from college after graduation, and before I started my job that I had accepted off campus, I walked down to his house and rang the doorbell and said, "Mr. Jackson," I introduced myself, and I said, I would really welcome the opportunity if you would listen to my demo tape. And I handed him the tape. That's how long ago it was. It was an actual reel-to-reel tape. And I said, "Would you listen to this and tell me if I have any chance in commercial radio?" And he was kind of a stoic guy. He kind of looked like Teddy Roosevelt, actually. And he said, "Sure, I'll listen, young man."
I love that.
He said, "I'll let you know in a couple of days." I said, "Okay." And he closed the door, and I walked back to the house. And 2 days later, I got a call from a gentleman named Michael J. Bunn, who I think is still on the air in Pittsfield at WBRK. I'm not sure, but he was the program director, or not program director. He was I think he was like the ops manager for the radio stations. And he asked if I'd come in to interview, and I did. And they hired me part-time at the radio station.
So it was like, you kept on maybe going through a process, and probably dad was like, "Okay, defense contractor, that makes sense, son." But like, you walked down the street, you kept veering in that direction of radio.
Yeah. And I mean, my family knew that I loved the radio. I loved radio. But nobody ever thought that, I shouldn't say nobody ever thought that, but there was never a discussion about whether or not that would be a career. And the interesting thing is that of the six, there were six of us. I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and none of us followed my father's footsteps into his line of work. we all went different directions. Everybody did something different.
Now, what did your dad do? Because there's probably some listeners who may remember
Recognize the name.
Sure.
Yeah, we actually moved up to the Berkshires in September of 1973 when he took the position of Vice President General Manager for E.D. Jones for Beloit Jones in Dalton. As a matter of fact, your dad worked for him.
Yeah, yes, he did. So I know one guy who remembers your dad. That's for sure.
And yeah, so we moved up here, and he was he was the American success story. He really was. He was born a poor kid. He was poor his whole life until after college, and ended up retiring as senior vice president at Beloit and at the corporate headquarters, and did very well. And he was just he was my hero, my idol, and my best friend. And I'll tell you, when fast forward a little bit, I'm now at this point working in New York, in of all things, HR personnel for a company called Rome Telecommunications, and I hated it. I hated every minute of it. And I was trying to get into radio. And my dad flies into on business, and he had reached out to me and said, let's grab dinner. And we grabbed dinner. And during dinner, he says to me, your sister tells me that you don't really want to do what you're doing, that you really would rather be in radio. And I said, yeah, I did. I said, but Dad, after all you've done for me, I didn't think that was kind of wise. And he said, why not? I said, because I didn't think you'd think it was the right move. And he said, Steve, I just want you to be happy. Go do it. But if you're going to do it, give it your best. And I did. And I've had a heck of a career.
Wow.
So anyway,
it's funny because we've had this conversation quite a bit on the podcast, and the power of parents. And actually what you said there was interesting, because you had a preconceived notion of disappointing him if you went in a direction, and thank God your dad knew,
Yeah.
like that is, that's the best dad move there is out there.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that he was, as I said before, he was my best friend, but he was also a phenomenal advisor. And we used to, for 30 years I lived in Connecticut, and especially after my kids were born, we would come up here to Lenox, where my parents lived, and we'd arrive on a Friday night, and while my wife was putting the kids to bed with my mother, my father would be in his den, and the two of us would sit and we'd talk. And the first question he'd ask me is, so what's going on at work? And we would talk about it, and I would ask him advice, and I would ask him, how he thought, I should handle things. As a matter of fact, one of the things I did in my career was I had the great opportunity to run Westwood One radio networks. And I remember when I was interviewing for the job, and they had given me all the data, all the financials and the statistics, and the company was really hurting. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy.
And this is when about was this?
This was in 2008, the spring of 2008, and my dad was in his final days. He was at that point, he was 84 years old, and he was failing in his health. And I brought everything up to him, and I said, hey, can you look this over and tell me what you think? And I'll never forget this. I gave him all the information on a Saturday afternoon, and I went out for a run, because as you know, I'm a big runner. And I came back from the run, showered up, went back into his den, and he was sitting there. He was as I said, he was in his final days. And I said, so what do you think? And he looked up at me and he said, do you think you can do it? And I said, yeah, I think I can. And he said, then you're halfway there. Go do it. He said, it's going to be tough, but from what you showed me and from what your plan to do it, because I had to do a pro forma as to how we were going to pull this thing out. he said, I think you're on track. And so I took the job, and we turned the company around, and it was a huge success. And he helped me in a couple ways before he died, with advice and how to handle some things that I was really up in the air as to how to handle. But so
that's beautiful.
Anyway,
that's beautiful.
So now,
oh man, that's awesome. You have had a career that has spanned this evolution of an industry that there aren't many. I mean, well, there have been. I'm sure there are other industries that have changed dramatically, but my God, in any kind of media over the last 30 years, the change has been dramatic. And with technology coming into play, with podcasts, with the internet and content everywhere accessible to everyone, many would think, wow, radio is a dying industry in some ways. And yet there you are, Westwood One, you revived that company, got it back. I'd love to know how that happened. But just overall, this industry, it has been quite a transition.
Yeah, it's funny, John, since before I started in radio, people were telling me that radio was dead, that radio was dying. Radio's been dying ever since TV was invented.
Maybe ever since the radio, TV, right. Even before.
And Charles Osgood had a great attitude about it. He would say, if radio was invented after TV, people would be like, wow, this is TV without the pictures. We can take it anywhere.
Right. That's a great point.
Yeah. And yes, radio has had an interesting lifespan, and it is, and I have to be honest with you, is that part of the problem and part of its troubles, a lot of its troubles, were self-inflicted. From decades, the business was run, and I don't mean this, I'll just say it, it was run by white guys, rich white guys, who never worried about innovating, never worried about anything coming at them. They were making good money, and it was and as technology came along, the best one is the internet and digital. At first, people running most of the radio businesses thought that it wasn't a factor, and they were wrong. And then it was like, oh my God, we gotta get into this. And then they didn't know how to go about it. And anyway, but over time, things have worked out to where digital is a very viable part of our business. And then the next thing was the streaming platforms. I'll tell you a really funny story. Is when I was at Westwood One, I got a call from the folks that ran Pandora, the original, the founder and his head of development, and they were based in Oakland, California, and they asked if we could if they can get a meeting with us, because they were contemplating, they were trying to figure out how to expand into the spoken word content. And so I said, sure, I'll come out. So I went out there with my head of my West Coast operations, and we walk into their building, and it was very impressive. And this big receptionist desk had Pandora, and I was like, wow, that's pretty cool, And we go into this conference room, and I started to just do a little bit of an intro as to us and to how Westwood One, what we were doing, and how we were bringing things back. And I said, it's kind of like what you're doing. I said, because basically this is very similar to radio, what you're doing. And I'll never forget, the woman's name was Jessica Steele, the head of development. She says, oh, Steve, we are not radio. I'm like, okay. So we progressed in our conversation.
Do not associate what we do with what you do.
well, wait a minute. It gets better. So we agreed to see if there was some way we could do a joint effort, and we went and we had worked about 6 months. I hadn't been back there, and about 6 months later we go back, and I walk into that same floor, that same receptionist desk, and this time it says Pandora, internet radio. And everybody at Pandora hates it when I tell that story. But
I bet.
and you know what? It's one of the things that radio had to adjust to is we had to wake up and realize that, hey, we were no longer the only source. We had to make sure that we were part of the American consideration set that for entertainment and engagement. And I think that's where radio has continued to succeed. And probably the best thing or one of the best things, I shouldn't say the best, I always talk in superlatives, I'm sorry, but one of the best things is that for radio was the pandemic. Because a phenomenon occurred in that people were alone, and they were quarantined, and people were stuck in their houses and were not in big groups, and there wasn't a lot of things to do. You couldn't go someplace to be entertained. You had to be home. But everyone was so concerned and so interested in what was going on in their local community, in their local area, and desperate for information as to what was the latest mandate, what was the latest development on the disease, and also on the vaccine front and whatnot. And radio saw a resurgence. Local radio saw a resurgence, and particularly in the smaller markets, what we call the secondary and tertiary markets. So that would be really markets from the radio markets are all numbered from number, I'd say 50 on down, and that's when I think radio did some of its best work, and in the time of local how do I say challenges, whether it's a storm or a traumatic event or a pandemic, radio always shines, and there is a huge trust factor with local radio, and television has destroyed its trust factor with the public, and that's because it was all about ratings. With radio, for the most part, because it is so segmented by format and whatnot, people still go back to not only be entertained, but to be engaged and to be informed. And so I since the pandemic, in many instances, the business is doing better than it was before the pandemic.
I look at it, and you've worked for some really big companies. I mean, Westwood One is one. I think you worked for Clear Channel at some point. Even our friends at Town Square, you worked with them for a little bit. And
Greater Media. Don't forget Greater Media.
Greater Media. So I find that the best that radio does is when these big companies find a way to effectively localize. So because radio is, it's like Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. I think all radio is local, this terrestrial situation where you have this immediacy to what's happening right here. And so it doesn't matter how big the company is. It could be a nationwide company, but each one of those signals that people tune in when they're driving, between 8 a.m. and 8:30 to drop their kids off to school, or driving home from work at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock. That's when radio is at its best.
Yes, and you hit the nail on the head. It's all about local. It's all about local. And it's funny because just last week, or 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry, the National Association of Broadcasters had their annual convention out in Las Vegas, and it was the first time it was in person in 3 years. And two of the CEOs of the two largest radio groups, one being iHeart, the other one being Odyssey. Bob Pittman from iHeart and David Field from Odyssey. They were on a panel, and they talked about radio, and I thought it was really interesting. I wasn't there, but I read the reporting of it, that they touted the localism of radio and how important that is, and how success is all based on the local ability to engage people and the trust factor. And yet those two companies 10 years ago tried to make themselves national platforms. And they are very successful companies, and those two men are very, very, very bright and successful men. But it's interesting that it was the first time in which I heard that to that degree, and I was like, okay, this is good, because this is exactly what we should be doing. And the numbers back it. Radio. When I first got into radio back in, I shudder when I say this, commercial radio. When I got into radio in 1981 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, radio reached 87% of the adult population of the United States.
It's amazing.
It is still, we still reach 84% of the adult population of the United States is reached by regular local radio. Television, currently broadcast television, and this data was just out about a month ago. The reach of broadcast television has dropped to 55%. When back in the 80s, it was like 93, 94.
Yeah, I like to think of it in the way of the behavior, and just think of how people approach things, because you can imagine that the amount of time that someone would then sit in front of a television to watch local TV, there are so many more things competing for that, literally your desktop. And of course, there's the phone, and there's the iPad, or what have you. So many different things that you can be doing to get similar information. Whereas the radio, you're in the mix. You have the Bluetooth, okay, so you can listen to a podcast, the John Kroll podcast, or for example, you can do that. But I find myself every morning when I drop off my kids, I flip it between maybe a podcast, but then I want to see what's on the FM dial to see what the two the two morning hosts are talking about. If they're on, if it's a commercial, then I flip over to the community radio station, see what's going on there. And then if I'm not interested in that, I may go to NPR. And I think a lot of people do that. So when you're talking about that, that is a real number that makes a lot of sense, because it's in the mix. It may not be, okay, I'm sitting down listening to the radio, but it's part of the behavior, I think, of that many people. Yeah.
And it's all about engagement, and people, everybody through the different iterations that came at radio said, oh, this is going to be the end of radio. One of them was satellite radio.
Right.
Satellite radio is when you boil it down, their reach is extremely small.
Right.
And
even if when they give those free trials, when you get the new car.
Right. And by the way, if you re-sign, they count it as another subscription.
Oh man.
But it's a choice, okay. So you have a choice there. You could go into satellite radio or but the thing is that where I was going with this topic is that radio has the ability, and I call it the wow factor. We have the opportunity to impress the listener, to give them something that they didn't anticipate. If you're listening to a streaming service like a Pandora or Spotify, they're all set on algorithms that are based on what your past history is. What have you been listening to? What do you choose? It's all based on how you have operated in the past.
Right.
Well, after a while, that becomes boring.
Super boring.
And there's and this is something that I've been, and as a matter of fact, and if he listens to this, he's going to be a little surprised, but my current operations manager and I are in a bit of a debate, because he's like, no, we have to play the songs that people want to, always want to hear. And I'm like, no, why don't we give them a little something like a surprise? Let's see every once in a while,
right?
Mix it up, and I think that's one of the things that radio can do that no other medium can do.
Yeah. And I think in a way, it's how sometimes these tiny community radio stations that have like zero budget can sometimes get a chunk of market share because you have the creativity there. So like, they're actually playing some like deep tracks from like Led Zeppelin or something, and people love that. Well, are you going to get a huge percentage of market share? Probably not, but like you get these super loyal listeners, and there's value to that. So, there's a lot of creativity in there. And when I do hear from program directors, they take great pride in that, because there is this idea, all right, well, you're an adult AC, whatever, and we're going to just roll with it. And every, 2 hours, you're going to hear this song or whatever the pattern is, that sort of thing. And there's sort of understanding on that, because people do listen in certain patterns. They have their drive times, they have this and that with as far as their behavior goes. So you kind of anticipate that with the number of times you play these songs. But the really good program directors do throw those flavorful sort of mixes. Like you'll get that 90s tune in there, or so, and I've had these conversations a lot with them, and sometimes you hear that song that you haven't heard since college, and you're like, yeah, that's awesome. All right. Like, and it leads to some more loyalty, I think.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that, you got to, hang on a second, my phone is going off here. I'm sorry.
Sorry, we'll post that.
You have to edit that out. I think that I lost my train of thought here.
Great program directors.
Program directors, and it's it's true that most people want to hear a certain block of songs, and they don't venture far, and you can't, I remember when I was young, a lot of times they would do like the thing they would do is 2 for Tuesdays, and they play 2 songs from an artist. Well, the risk there, they found out, is that what if you don't like that artist? Right. Then the person's leaving. The person's like, not sticking around for 2.
I got 9 minutes of this crappy band.
So the magic is in being able to keep the listener engaged and keep them listening, and not burn them out, I guess is the best way to put it. Because it will get stale. But the other thing I think that radio can do that other mediums can't do, and it really, and I realized this when I went to Detroit in 2013. I accepted a position to run a radio group for Greater Media in Detroit.
By the way, you're kind of known in the industry as a fixer.
Well, that's what. That's where I was going with this. You
did it at Westwood 1. If you can do it there.
And well, the Detroit challenge was even bigger, because we had 3 radio stations. 2 of them were heritage radio stations. One was station WCSX, which was the original classic rock station. It was the first classic rock station ever put on the air. And then we had WRIF, which the faithful in Detroit call it Riff. And Riff it just celebrated its 50th year on the air, and it is without a doubt one of the greatest rock radio stations ever. And Detroit is one of the greatest rock markets ever to exist, and still is. And anyway, I got there, and not even 3 weeks after I got there was this terrible incident in which a police officer in one of the suburbs of Detroit was shot and killed making a traffic stop. And he had left a wife with 3 kids under the age of 6. And my producer of the morning show for WCSX, it wasn't Riff, but it was CSX. He said, "We got to do something. You know, we really should do something." So I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" He says, "I want to put together a concert." And I'm like, "Okay, let's just be careful what the expense is, blah, blah." Well, anyway, long story short, he was able to get people like Grand Funk Railroad, Mitch Ryder, several other really well-known Detroit acts. And we put on a concert at the Royal Oak Amphitheater. And it was amazing, the response in the community. And I mean, people were lined up around the block to get into this show. And we made $60,000 for this woman in one night in Royal Oak, Michigan. It was maybe 4 months after Detroit declared bankruptcy. So times were hurting. And so many, as I was standing there and people were coming up to the talent, and I was listening to what they were saying to the DJs and how, you know, this is what it's all about. This is so great. You guys are doing it. And I was like, my God, we got to do more in the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we did. And those 2 radio stations, when I got there, Riff had dropped to 7th in the market and CSX was 13th, and our AC station was 17th. And by improving the on-air performance, claiming the Detroit mantle that they rightly had, you know, that was the other thing. It's like, we are Detroit's radio stations. Let's make sure we tout that. But, you know, let's be proud of that. But then let's get involved in the community. Let's make sure that people see that we're a part of this and we're helping to pull the city out and the area out, because the suburbs around Detroit weren't hurting. The city was, though. But anyway, and through that, in 4 years, we went from 7th, 13th, and 17th to number 1 and tied for number 2. The other 2 stations were actually tied by the time that Greater Media was sold to Beasley Media. And those stations are still incredibly popular, incredibly successful.
I find that radio, as far as media outlets, they're the ones that people like, you know, you can look at numbers. Maybe a newspaper has X amount of readers, maybe the TV or online entities, you know, have certain numbers, but there are very few, if any, I don't think any other, you know, of the media outlets, types of media that have that personal connection. You know, there's something very personal. I mean, as we're talking, you know, here, this is an intimate setting, you know, you're talking to them, you hear voices, and there's something I've always, that's what, and probably since you were a little kid at 7 years old, you know, you understood that just innately, but there is a certain intimacy there, which I think gives radio that opportunity to do things like that more effectively.
Yeah, and that is, you know, that is a part of the magic and part of the success of the medium, is that it is 1-to-1. You know, you can't do that with TV. You definitely can't do it with digital.
Yeah,
this is really the only medium where we can actually talk to, you know, an individual. You know, Don Imus, one of the most famous radio personalities ever, in his farewell broadcast, the last thing he said, he addressed the audience by saying, "You, I did it for you. It was, and right. You brought me great success and gave me my life." And I thought it was just a wonderful way to end his incredible career, was that he put it on a 1-to-1 level.
Yeah,
and that's again, it's what people crave. They want 1-to-1 interaction. You know?
And that is a really great lesson also for radio people out there, young people, is when you know, are approaching the microphone, think about it as you're speaking to one person,
Mhm.
as opposed to say, hey, everybody.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, everybody's out there, but you're not speaking to everybody. You're speaking to one person at a time,
Right.
which really is amazing. That's what the power of radio is. It
It
really
is.
is.
It is. It is. So that's, you know, that's what gets me up in the morning every day. I mean, I'm one of the few people. I have friends that make over $1 million a year and they're miserable in their jobs.
Mm.
I've gone to work every single day loving what I do, and it's been fun, and it hasn't been I've, as you know, John, I've had ups and downs.
Sure.
There have been some real slow periods, but it's been great. It's been great.
And so with you, you kind of have this, I guess, quasi, sales. I know there's a big portion of your time when it was sales, and then there's operations. Not to get too much into the anatomy of what makes up the radio sort of operation and the organizational chart, but how would you describe? Of course, you're an owner now, so we're going to get to that in a little bit. But in your career, there's been times where it has been primarily sales and operations, later on. So how did you evolve from, okay, I'm a radio guy, maybe I want to be on the air a little bit, I'm reading news, I get to go do some stuff at WBEC, and then I want to continue in this industry, and make a good living, and that's a conversation a lot of radio people have. It's like, okay, I love radio. How do I make a living in this? You certainly have done that, but tell me about that approach and how your career has evolved that way.
Well, it's interesting. I've as I already said, I got into it because I loved radio, and I loved the whole idea of being able to, be on the radio. I learned pretty quickly after my time I was at WBEC for about 1.5 years, and did okay, had the opportunity to then jump to WPYX in Albany when they went on the air. Pix 106.
Pix 106, baby.
Capital Land's Rock Authority. And I did that for about another year. And then my day job, as I said, I was working at the defense contractor at the same time. They promoted me and offered me a promotion and transfer to their corporate headquarters down in Greenwich, Connecticut. And I had to make a decision. And I was making peanuts on the radio, but my main job was this, defense contractor thing. And I had taken a job there out of college in what was called the production control department, and was quickly promoted in Schenectady, first to a supervisor on the manufacturing floor, which was that's another story for another podcast. But then when Reagan really started the push to improve the military, we had to go to a 3-shift operation, and the plant manager felt that the guy who was in human resources couldn't handle it, so he made me the head of HR. I was 23 years old.
Oh my God.
And yeah, it was crazy.
Wow.
And so I did that for about 1.5 years. And then they promoted me, as I said, down to Greenwich, Connecticut, and they put me in charge of production. I was a head of production for the M155 howitzer cannon, which was the most strategic ground weapon in the U.S. Army at the time. I was 25 years old.
And by the way, you could have continued that career. You probably would have been miserable, because it wasn't radio. But
right, right. But
you had that fork in the road, right?
Right.
There.
So anyway, and I only tell you that, and you can edit as much of that out as you want, is because what then happened was I went down to Greenwich with my sole intention, and I had to quit the job at PYX because I obviously couldn't commute between Albany and Greenwich. So I said to myself, I'll go down there, I'll do this, but I'm going to really try to get into New York radio. somehow get into New York radio. And
yeah, Greenwich isn't too far, right?
no,
Like,
Greenwich was a 25-minute train ride into Manhattan. And so I was down. I went to Greenwich, and 8 months into it, they announced that they're moving the headquarters to Waterbury, Connecticut. And I was like, oh no. So I quit. Oops, sorry. I quit. And I'd had some money saved up, and I tried to get into CBS or NBC or ABC, and wasn't getting anywhere, and had to get another job. And so I accepted the job as an HR manager for a company called Untitled Communications, and they had a location in White Plains, and then they had an operation in Manhattan, right on Park Avenue and 46th Street. And my role was to be the HR guy for the Manhattan operation. I'm like, all right, at least I'm on the island. I got a chance to get into. And I was there about a year, and one day I get a call from this headhunter, and I'll never forget her name. Her name was Maxine Circus. And Maxine said, Steve, I'm calling because I've been sent by a Fortune 200 company that really needs somebody to help with the corporate staffing. And you have and they asked me to reach out to you to see if you have any interest in it. And I'm like, why would they want to talk to me? And I was like, no, Maxine, I'm not really interested. I don't want to stay in HR. I'm actually trying to get into some other line of work, but thank you very much. And she called me about 3 or 4 times. Finally, I said, Maxine, tell me who it is. And, maybe. But so she said, and this is again showing how old I am. She said, it's RCA. Now, RCA at the time owned NBC. As soon as she said RCA, I said, I'll take the interview. I interviewed with RCA. RCA was planning on moving their corporate offices out of 30 Rock, and they were going to put NBC in Secaucus, and the rest of RCA was moving back down to Princeton, New Jersey, where RCA actually got started. And they needed somebody to oversee the actual, moving of the people, making sure we do that right. And so I said to the person who was doing the hiring, I said, I'll do this, but when it's done, obviously I won't have a job. I said, but when it's done, if it's done properly, I really want a shot at getting into NBC. He said, Steve, if you pull this off, you'll be able to go anywhere.
It's so funny how, like, I don't know, the universe was kind of like knocking on your door. Hey, we got an interview for you. Hey, we got an interview. You're like, no, I want to work in radio. It's
also a message. And I've told my kids, I've told lots of young people this, and my kids included, any opportunity to advance, if there's a path that you see, take it. Because I took a chance, and what happened is that I'm working at RCA again. It was 8 months, almost to the day, that I'm doing the job. Everything's going great. And my boss calls me in his office and he says, hey, you know how you wanted to get to NBC? I'm going to get you there sooner. I was like, why? Am I not doing a good job? He goes, no, you're doing a great job. He said, but NBC has a real problem, and they need somebody that has union experience, which I had from my defense contractor, because the manufacturing, the workers were represented by the UAW. So I had to deal with the UAW. So they need somebody with union experience, obviously HR experience, and also understands the radio business. I was like, okay. So I go down to, I drive up, because I was based in Princeton, New Jersey, because as I said, they were moving everybody to Princeton. I drive up to 30 Rock. I meet with a gentleman by the name of Gene McGuire, who was the head of employee relations for NBC. And he had me meet with about 6 people, the 2 general managers, the general manager of NBC AM, the general manager of WHYA, the general manager of the NBC radio networks, which there were 4 of them, and then I had to meet with the program director for NBC AM and the program director for YNY, and they all liked me, and I was offered the job, and I made the transfer. I started, I'll never forget this. I started on St. Patrick's Day, and I go into Gene's office. I meet him in his office, and he closes the door. He says, "Now I'm going to tell you why you're really here. We're firing Howard Stern, and we got to make sure that this doesn't get screwed up."
Oh, man.
I was like, "Oh man."
No wonder you had to meet 6 people.
So anyway, without going into all those details, I was then in charge of, my title was Director of Employee and Artist Relations, which I thought was a great title for a pretty lousy job. But it was, but I was involved in the radio division, and heavily involved in the radio division. And fortunately, the general managers of the two general managers of the radio stations and the head of the networks all saw that I understood the business, and so they would let me. Like, I actually sat in their staff meetings. I had a lot of, I was involved in a lot of decisions, and
so did you fire Howard Stern?
Well, I didn't do the firing. No. But I had to make sure that
from private parts. They were like WNBC.
Yeah.
That whole thing. Oh man.
Well,
was any of that accurate at all, or was that just totally?
Well, the movie. If you remember, in the movie, Robin gets fired, not Howard.
Oh, okay.
But in the book, Howard, there's a chapter about Howard's getting fired, and it was the greatest thing that happened to him, and it was the end of NBC radio.
Yeah.
Because what happened was, I think it was the following December, or it might have been a year later, GE bought RCA, and Jack Welch's motto was, if you're not number 1, 2, or 3, or mantra, not motto, if you're not number 1, 2, or 3 in your business, either fix it or get rid of it. And he didn't have the patience to wait for radio to fix itself. And quite honestly, looking back on it, the people that were there weren't going to be capable of fixing it. And so they decided to dismantle it. And I was given the role of handling, again, the personnel side of it. All the radio stations, and we had 60 something radio stations in 13 markets, and we had to sell them all, and then we had to sell the networks, and we had to handle all the terminations and whatnot, and we did it, and it was pretty bleak. As a matter of fact, we sold NBC AM, and the company that bought it, Emmis, turned it into FAN, WFAN. And when it was all done, I'll never forget this. My boss now was a guy by the name of Jeff Trollinger. He was from GE. I'll never forget. Jeff comes in my office and he goes, "Steve, you did such a great job. We've got a huge position for you. We want you to go out and be the vice president of human resources for our white appliance division in Circleville, Ohio." And I said, "Jeff, thank you very much, but I'm not going to do that."
Not going into appliances, thank you.
So you asked me how I got. So what I did was, in a panic, I then reached out to everybody I could think of to see, what should I do? What should I do? And they were all people in the radio business that I'd met through NBC. And they all said the same thing. They all said, "Well, you already have a firm understanding of programming and production. You've got the corporate side, okay, because you just spent, the last 2 years in the corporate side of the business. If you really, because I wanted to get into radio management, and they said, if you really want to get into management, you got to do a stint in sales." And I hated sales. I did not see myself as a salesperson, because first of all, I'm extremely shy, and I'm not good at cocktail parties. But I said, "You know what? I'll give it a shot." And I was and they said the best place to go was CBS FM, which at the time was the oldies station in New York. They were known for developing the best salespeople. So I got an interview, and the general sales manager there was a guy by the name of Steve Carver, and the local sales manager was a woman named Maura Mason. And the three of us connected and hit it off, and they hired me. I took a huge cut in pay.
I was going to say, because now you've gone from basically like a VP level of HR, and now you're like an account executive who's going to have like a territory, probably, what do they say? Killing what you eat and you know, that sort of thing. Like you were probably working on a big chunk of your salary is probably commission at that point.
Yeah, it was. There was a small base. Oh, no, there wasn't a small base. What am I talking about? It was all. There was no small base. It was drug versus commission. So they did give me a guarantee my first year, which was about 40% of what I was making at the time.
Mm.
But
so you were really taking the leap.
Yeah,
I mean, you really want to be in radio,
right? But I wasn't married. I didn't even own a house at the time. I was, renting, and I had some money in the bank. So I was like, you know what, let me take a shot.
Yeah.
And it worked out incredibly well, because what I found out was that when it's my job, I was able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would force myself to do cold calling, which scared the heck out of me. I remember the first time I went cold calling, I remember I threw up in a garbage can outside of the first place I went into, because I was so nervous. But
you get used to it, and sometimes it's like, you just got to do it. You got to pick up the phone and just dial the number and just do it, and it gets easier from there.
And I also found out that it was easier because I believed in it. I believed in the medium. I believed in what it could do. And the best bit of advice that Maura and Steve gave me is that you're not selling Bibles. Okay. What you have to do, and by that they meant everybody knows what's in the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
and you're gonna, if you're gonna buy a Bible, it's because you want what's in it.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing is you have to convince someone that you can help them succeed.
Yeah.
And you got to show them. And it's not about selling stuff. It's about helping them succeed.
Yeah.
And it was the most valuable lesson and most valuable approach that I ever got. And that was the basis of my success. And I've insisted that in every organization I've run, is that we are solution based. We use this powerful medium to make things happen for the people who invest their money in us. Because if they don't succeed, we don't succeed.
That's right.
And CBS-FM took off pretty quickly after I got there. And it wasn't because of me. It was just because we had the right group of people. We had phenomenal talent. And we went from 5th in the market in billing to number 1 in New York in billing. And we held that for a couple of years. And then FAN started really coming on, and anyway, by then I went to back in those days at CBS. In order to get into management, you had to do a stint in national sales. So after 6 years at CBS-FM, I went to CBS Radio Reps. It was called. It was a national sales arm of CBS Radio. And we had 110 radio stations around the country that we would sell to national advertisers like Home Depot, Home Depot didn't exist then, but like American Airlines,
McDonald's.
It's
the one that you always hear.
Yes.
Every morning.
So
is it true one time? I mean, this is a little sidebar. Did McDonald's try to just stop radio for like,
yes.
I don't know, and it lasted like a day or two when they went back to it?
Yeah, it lasts. I think it lasts a little more than a day.
Yeah,
but not.
I wasn't sure if that
but
was.
But their sales plummeted in certain parts of the country, and they're like, "Oh my God, we got to get back on the radio."
I just wasn't sure if that was an urban myth.
No, it's true. That's a true story. So then I went to the national division, which I didn't want to go to because I just wanted to be local. And I have to say that in hindsight, I'm glad I went, because it showed that I learned a whole different level of not only level of selling, but level of how to make things work on a bigger scale.
Mhm.
And that was because we're selling 110 radio stations. You don't always sell all 110 to an advertiser. You sell the ones that make sense for that advertiser. But you had to make it work around, in the United States, not just in one market.
Right.
And
it's hard to say, oh yeah, we'll slip in an ad after so you get 110 stations,
yeah,
like how does that work?
Yeah. And it was also more of a how do I say, now the term is programmatic type of sale, which you're just selling numbers and audience, but
then it becomes a little bit less creative. It's just more of a numbers game, in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
you think.
Yeah. And so and I was good enough that I, after a year, or a little over a year, I was made New York sales manager, and then a year later I was promoted to VP GM of the entire division. And right after I got that title, Mel Karmazin, who was a very famous radio mogul, who has been retired for a while, but he's the guy that made Howard Stern on the FM dial. Mel bought CBS Radio, and he immediately sold off our division to a company called Interrep. And Interrep didn't own any radio stations. It was just basically a broker of time for radio, and it was awful for me. And I went and worked at Interrep for about a year and a half, and one day I get a call from this guy. His name was Jimmy DeCastro, and Jimmy DeCastro was the CEO of a company called Chancellor Media. And Chancellor Media had become famous a few months before for being the first company to ever pay $100 million for a radio station. And the radio station was WLTW in New York.
Okay.
And through friends, mutual friends, he had heard that I was pretty good and that I was miserable. And
it's a good combination for an opportunity.
Yeah. So one night, I'll never forget this, because it was in 98, because my wife was pregnant with my first child, with our first child, with Damien and my son. And I was watching the World Series, and the phone rings, and she answers the phone, and she gives it to me. She says, "It's Jimmy DeCastro." And I'm like, "Jimmy DeCastro? What's he calling me for?" It can't be Jimmy DeCastro. It has to be somebody, trying to punk me or something. So I pick up and go, "Hey, Jimmy, how's it going?" And he's like, "Oh, it's not going too good." I'm like, "Oh my God, this is really Jimmy DeCastro." Because he was a pretty well-known person in the industry, and I knew his voice. I was like, "Oh my God, it's really Jimmy DeCastro." And he said, "Steve," he goes, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you could help me out." And I said, "Yeah, I guess." I don't know what he wanted. And he says, "I hear you're pretty good." I said, "Well, thank you." And he says, "I just bought a radio station for $100 million. And the local management is telling me that not only aren't they going to beat the market and in sales performance, but they're not even going to keep pace with the market." And he said, "I didn't buy $100 million. I didn't spend $100 million to not pace with the market."
Oh my God.
He said, "I need somebody to take this over for me." And I said, "Well," I'm like, "Wow." He says, he goes, "Are you going to be in your office tomorrow?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he says, "Good. I'm going to be in New York too." He said, "I tell you what, why don't we meet in Bryant Park at 11 o'clock? And I'm like, and Bryant Park at the time had two like restaurants, the cafe and the grill. I said, "Do you mean the grill or the cafe?" He goes, "No, I mean the park."
The park.
I'm like,
This is like clandestine,
Okay.
CIA meeting or
Yeah.
something.
So I'm like, okay, Jimmy. And he goes, well, you know what I look like, right? I said, yeah. And he says, he goes, and I understand, you're 6'4", dark hair. I'm like, yeah. And at the time I had a mustache. I go, yeah, that's me. And he goes, we'll find each other. And sure enough, at 11 o'clock the next morning, I'm standing at 43rd Street and 6th Avenue, and up pulls this car, and out steps Jimmy DeCastro. We sit down on a bench, and we worked out a deal. And 2 weeks later, I was the general sales manager of WLTW. Wow. And that radio station at the time was fourth. It was number one in ratings in every day part except morning because of Howard. But we're number one in adults, women, and men in every other day part. Wow. And we were only fourth in billing in New York City. Mm. And what I found out quickly was it was because of the attitude that the radio station had in the community. Yeah. Their attitude was like, hey, we're Light FM. If you don't want it, somebody else will buy it. Mm. And I immediately said, oh my God, I got to go on a goodwill tour and show people that, we got a different attitude now.
Right. Like if you don't want to do business with us, screw you. We'll exactly. Go to the next guy. And that turns clients off. That turns advertisers off.
It not only does it turn advertisers off, but it then quite honestly, it does come across on the air. Mm. And so
isn't that interesting how the sort of culture of us, and you would think, okay, well, it's the personalities who are in there. Yeah, but those personalities are a part of a living organism that is the station. That includes the sales, that includes the operations people, and all that. I mean, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and the program director at the time was a guy named Jim Ryan. And Jim Ryan is without a doubt one of the true geniuses of programming. And Jim is now ironically programming WCBS-FM in New York, which is number one with of the music stations. And Jim was just a phenomenal partner. I met him, and he hated sales. He hated everybody that was in sales before me. And I just said to him, look, and I told him my experience. I told him what I had done going all the way back to Pittsfield. And I said, I'm here because I love this. I will never cannibalize your radio station. As a matter of fact, all I want to do is I want to make it greater. And he and I became really good friends. Mm. And to this day, we're good friends. And Jim and I took that radio station from fourth in billing in New York City to number one in billing in the world.
Wow.
To seven, we built $70 million in 2001, even with 9/11 affecting fourth quarter. It was the first time and the only time a radio station has ever billed $70 million. Amazing. To this day. Wow. And we stayed between 70 and 66 million for the next 6 years.
Wow.
And yeah. And and that's how I got to West One, because Chancellor Media had sold to Clear Channel, and they sold to Clear Channel in 2000. And then 2001 we had our monster year, and then we were the biggest radio station in the world, and we returned 65 cents of every dollar to the bottom line. It was just unbelievable, the radio station. And we did things that radio stations never did before. Like there's a thing now, there's an event every summer in New York called Broadway and Bryant Park. It's every Thursday afternoon from July 4th to Labor Day. Broadway shows come out and perform at lunchtime for free. Myself and our promotion director at the time, Bridget Sullivan, started that. Hmm. We went to the park and said, and I have to be honest, Bridget was approached by the Producers Guild for Broadway because I don't know if you were probably too young, but in 1998 there was a pretty bad recession and Broadway was really hurting. Mm. And so by time 2000 came around, they were really in dire straits, and they said, is there anything you can do? And Bridget came up with the idea. Yeah. I just made it work, and I got the contacts at the park, and Anyway, that's now a New York institution.
Yeah.
Well, radio did that. Radio created that.
Mhm.
And that's another thing that I learned. And I've done stuff like that around the country since then. And so I'm jumping all over the place, but I get to
But that's the
so
but that being open to that. And I think, and that goes to the culture, because if you have a radio station of people who just want to go through the motions, I think that's any business. I mean, whether it's WBEC or New York City or Beloit Corporation, whatever it is, if you have a group of people who are just going to sort of go through the motions and do what is in their job description, but that creativity, I don't care what industry, but that's a big deal. And I mean, it does creativity. It's powerful.
It's extremely powerful. And the success of that event is directly tied to the fact that we were reaching people one-on-one and telling them, come on down to Bryant Park on Thursday afternoon for free concerts. And we told the producers it can't be the understudies. It's got to be the stars. So we had like Kristen Chenoweth out there.
Wow.
I remember James Brolin was in is it James Brolin? Yeah, the son, not the one that married Barbara Streisand. I think it's James. I forget, maybe not. Josh Brolin. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's true.
Anyway, the guy was big in Broadway. We had Nathan Lane out there. We had Matthew Broderick performing. Anyway, so that's just another example of the power of radio and what I love about radio is how you can do those things. So anyway, Clear Channel took us over in 2000. By the time 2008 came around, there was I was looking for my next thing, and
because I mean, Clear Channel has a very negative connotation. Of course, it doesn't exist anymore, right? Clear Channel.
Well, it's iHeart.
It's iHeart.
They changed their name to iHeart.
They rebranded because their reputation had so. I mean, what happened there? Because I remember when I hear Clear Channel, it's like, oh, this massive conglomerate that's just gonna go and go buy all these stations and cut everybody and so on and so forth. So what happened there?
Well, I think they became so big. There's only you really get to the point where you're so big. There's only so many ways you can manage all that. And they also took on $21 billion in debt, and to service that debt is insane. They had to do major cost cutting. They had to find ways to satisfy the FCC licenses that they have by broadcasting, but they had to cut costs in a big way. And the easiest thing to do is just homogenize everything. Yeah. And
really hollows everything out. Like you talk about how radio is local, but when you're doing that across this massive, I mean, you're really just cutting out the heart and soul of a lot of stations, I'm sure.
Yeah. And this is prior to Bob Pittman getting there. The prior management really did a huge disservice to the radio industry, and that's part of what the problem of radio and what we're trying to overcome now. And that was one of the things that I did not agree with. I was running their biggest radio station, and they didn't care. They didn't care anything about the radio station. They didn't care about. All they wanted was for us to conform to what their models were going to be. And I was like, I don't think so. And I was really lucky that a good friend of mine, who was not in the radio business or the TV business, he was actually in publishing, had an opportunity to go in and be the president of Westwood One. And CBS was selling their stake in Westwood One, and a private equity firm by the name of the Gores Group had bought the 73% share that CBS had. And they were making changes, and they hired my friend. And it was funny, when he was interviewing, he was first interviewing to be for the position of president of CBS Radio. And he had reached out to me and said, "Hey, I got an opportunity in your space, and I don't know anything about it. Can we meet?" And we would meet for beers on Tuesday nights, right across from Grand Central before we both jumped on our trains home. And he would have a list of questions, and I would give him the answers. And he didn't get the CBS radio gig, but Les Moonves, who was the head of CBS, really liked him. And it was the right move, because CBS's problems in radio at the time were programming based, and they hired Dan Mason, who was a programmer, and Dan is a wonderful man and a wonderful programmer. And my buddy Tom wasn't a programmer, and quite honestly didn't know radio that well, but Moonves really liked him, and Moonves wanted him close. So even though CBS was selling Westwood One, Westwood One was still the syndicator for CBS Radio News. And so they were our biggest client, so to speak, or biggest vendor, I should say, not a client. And so my friend Tom got the job at Westwood One, and I continued to advise him on Tuesday nights. And then at one point he just said, he goes, "This is crazy." He goes, "Why don't you just come work with me?" I'm like, well, okay. And I was ready. And you talk about another leap of faith. I had never been in network radio. I didn't even like network radio. I didn't like the way it was even sold or how it worked, because it was not based on performance. It was just based on selling as many spots as you can, and not caring whether or not it worked. And network radio was in serious trouble back then, and particularly Westwood was. And we went in there, and I quickly realized that a network is just a big radio station.
Yeah, I was thinking that, because they're creating the content, but they're selling ads as a part of this, and then that's sort of like getting patched in through this, but there's still content being created. That's got to be quality content. You got to sell it.
Yeah, and what really opened my eyes was I joined Westwood One in June of 2008, and the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, China was that September, and we were the exclusive audio. We had the exclusive rights to the audio for the Olympics. So we would take clients. We took clients over to the Olympics, and so I'll never forget this. It was the first time my wife had ever been away from our kids, and our kids were Damien was 10 and Alexandra was 8, and so we're on the plane to Beijing, and I was introduced to this gentleman, Dave Curvin, and his daughter Montana. And Montana was 10, and we had invited clients and a guest, and he took his daughter, his 10-year-old daughter. And Dave was the head of marketing for Intuit, and Intuit's biggest product to this day is TurboTax.
Okay.
And so, I meet him on the plane, and he was sitting across the aisle from me, and we get talking, and I'm telling him I'm new, and I have my grand ideas, I'm doing the whole sales type thing, and he says to me, he says, "That's fascinating." He goes, I want to talk to you more about all that. So we were in Beijing for a total of 6 days, because the way we worked it was we did 3 different waves of 3 different groups of clients. And I'd spent most of those 6 days, Dave was with me, he and his daughter were with me and my wife and a bunch of other clients. And we got to know each other pretty good. And on the way back, on the flight back, he says to me, "You know something?" He says, "I've been advertising on Westwood One for 10 years. He said, 10 years ago, I invested $90,000 with Westwood One. He said, at the time, my budget was $1.5 million. He said, my budget is now $15 million. and you're still getting $90,000. And he said, and he said 3 days ago, you asked me how am I measured? He said, nobody ever asked me that before. He said, if you can help me hit my goals, you'll see a lot more than $90,000. I said, Dave, and they were based in I think they're still based in San Diego. He was based in San Diego. I said, Dave, let me come out and see you. So I went out and saw him. We created this incredible program. And it was, and the reason I'm saying this is because I suddenly realized that I didn't have to change my approach. I just had to make the approach work on that level. And we did. We changed everything about how network radio was sold. We changed the industry. That year, or actually the next year, 2009, we had counted for 65% of the growth of network radio. Wow. And we were the number 3 player in the field.
And so what was it? What was so you had the conversation with him in San Diego.
And what they were and they, to this day, they still, TurboTax's biggest competitor is H&R Block.
Sure.
But TurboTax at the time, this was the first time anybody ever came out with basically a tutorial for doing your taxes. And that's what TurboTax was. And they had online help, but you basically did it yourself. They sent you this little kit with DVDs, and you basically followed that. And he just needed to get the message out, and to his credit, he had already established, I've got to get this done, not in April, not in March. Our window is December to middle of February, end of February. Okay, if we're going to make this work. Well, CBS, Westwood One had the Super Bowl, and we had the Grammys. And so what we did is we started, and the Grammys, the nominees are announced in December. So we came up with this whole concept of letting listeners, vote on who they think the Grammy winners are going to be. And then we had access to the dress rehearsals for the Grammys. The Grammys are always on Sunday night, and the dress rehearsals are Thursday and Friday. And we would have this thing called Radio Row, in which we would have space. I forget how many stations. I think it was like 80 radio stations that were our affiliates, that they could come out, and we would provide space for them, and they can broadcast from Radio Row. And the Grammy Foundation and us would make sure that all this talent would come through, and they would just interview people, and they would just go from radio station to radio station being interviewed. And it was great for the record labels. It was great for the artist. It was great for the radio station. So we made it great for TurboTax. And one of the things that we said to every radio station is, every act, you got to ask them, what's the one thing you don't, or what, how do you feel about paying your taxes? And of course, everybody says they hate it. And then we recorded each of them, and then we created spots for them in which the talent was, talking about how terrible their taxes experience was, and that TurboTax could help them. And it was their sales increased 30% in that 1 year, in the first year.
It's amazing how just a simple concept, just a simple question can do it. Do it. There he was, doing his 90,000, just getting his spots, for all those years. And then, and just that creativity, just putting it in a different framework, and then just doing a little extra work to put those spots together, crushes it.
Yeah.
Crushes it.
And we went from, I forget what the first year they paid. But 4 years later, when I left, we had a $4 million contract a year with TurboTax.
Yeah, it's a pretty solid increase.
Yeah, nice. But that's because we got results. Because we got results.
Of course. Yeah.
And it really was just the it's all about making things happen for people. And getting back to our original conversation about radio, is that you have to have the same approach for not only for the clients but for the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to satisfy them. We've got to the only way people are gonna stay with a radio station or a podcast is if they feel it's worth it, if they feel that they're getting something out of it, and that it's worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Another interesting thing is that I laugh when people say that young people don't listen to radio. They don't listen to radio like we did, but I got a 22 and a 23-year-old that all through college, they both went to the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan rowing team used to practice listening to the rock station in Detroit. and that was after I left it, and they had riff on, and these kids, and you go to, I was just out of my daughter's graduation at her party. It was all music from my era they were playing. It's not the new music. They're listening to the classic rock station. They're listening to the country station, and the thing is that we have to do a better job of giving them a reason to stay with us. They're going to check it out. And that's the other thing, is young people, they'll go if somebody else tells them, hey, check this out. Whether they stay or not is how good you are.
Right. You got to have quality content. And I think ultimately quality content finds an audience because that it's worth listening to. Right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's actually very, very simple. But so it's not about the secret of, how do we unlock the secret of millennials? Well, great content. How do we Generation Z, create great content, and understand the audience. Obviously there's different things, but that I think sometimes we overthink that, or even when we get older, like, that younger generation that, people are people.
Yes.
And I don't care if you're a 15-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 70-year-old, again, quality content. People, younger people are listening to podcasts. So a lot of times people think, they're listening to podcasts and not radio. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because they'll listen to both.
Right.
They'll listen to all of it if it's worth listening to.
If it's worth listening to, exactly. And the two can coexist. As a matter of fact, my company, we have a podcast arm.
Sure.
And we're in the process. It's very infant stages because we've only been, I've only owned the business since November.
Yeah, but let's not bury the headline. You own 2 stations.
I own 4.
4. Oh, wait, did that change since the last time? Oh, Jesus.
4 stations, not 2.
Oh my God, you are the king of the Cape.
Yeah, I am. I'm Mr. Cape. Yeah, and talk about intelligent planning. I moved to the Berkshires and I acquire radio stations on the Cape. I'm Mr. Mass Pike. That's what I am.
That's right. You got
back and forth. But we are in the process of creating. We're revamping our websites. We're revamping pretty much every part of the business without, and we're doing it to hopefully without negatively impacting, our ratings position or anything like that in the market. But my goal is to have integration between the radio stations and podcasts, and have one play off the other. I believe that, and I'll tell you where I got the idea from is, if you ever watch the Sunday Today show, Willie Geist has his Sunday sit down, and on the TV show, they play about maybe 5 minutes, or maybe a little more of an interview. And then what does he say? For the rest of it, go to williegeist.com or whatever it is. I forget, or Sunday Sit Down or something like that.
Right.
And you get them to go there. And we've already started doing that with some of our musical programming, musical content, because the Cape, very much like the Berkshires, the music scene is starting to come back. Now, the Cape is, and that's the other thing I got to tell you that I just love. And I was very surprised when I moved back here 2 years ago, even though the pandemic, had us all on ice for about a year. There's more live music in the Berkshires now than there was when I left 40 years ago. Wow. And you can go anywhere, any night, and hear some really good music. The Cape is very similar, but not nowhere to the degree I think that the Berkshires are at. But the Cape was also a hotbed of music back in the day. I mean, bands like Jay Giles and Aerosmith and Boston, they all got their start on the Cape. They didn't get their start in Boston. They were from Boston, but they really made their names, particularly in the summertime, playing in clubs in the Cape. And there are many, many other people that also, many other good artists that also went through that. We have an opportunity to mine that in this right now. And that's one of the things that we have our eyes and ears open to out there, to make it relevant, because people want to hear local bands. People want to know what's going on. They want to be entertained. They want to be in the know. And if you're programming your stations the way that they've always been programmed, you're not going to get there. People are going to be like, I don't need this.
Yeah. That local flavor. And then especially if you have that scene that's happening. And that's actually interesting that you say it, because there's probably a lot of people in the Berkshires who don't think there's a lot of live music because maybe they're not aware of it or they're not looking for it. But you love music. You live here in the Berkshires, and you know what's going on here because you follow it.
It's wonderful, and it's good. It's not. I mean, we're not talking cover bands. We're talking real good original music, and from everywhere from Egremont to North Adams. There's just phenomenal music all over the place.
That's good.
So anyway,
and I think I guess some of those acts on. I've been working on a couple bands to get on the podcast. My setup isn't maybe ready for it, but but they can bring their amp in and just plug in, and we can do it that way. But so you transition, and then now you own stations. Okay?
Yes.
So and we had been talking during some of those times, and I know what you've been through, because it's not easy to buy radio stations. There's this industry is maybe insular in a way, in some ways, just the sort of mechanism of how you actually literally go to buy radio stations. So take us through that a little bit, and how and how you ended up succeeding in owning stations.
Well, first of all, I'll tell you, when I started the process, I had a lot more hair than I have now because it was pretty stressful. Actually, in all seriousness, it took about 6 years to actually get to the point where we closed on properties, and not having done it before, the biggest challenge was getting funding. Was being able to find people who will invest, and the big investment groups, they would tell me, oh yeah, you got a great reputation, your plan looks good, but we'd be more comfortable if you had experience. So I'm like, well, how am I going to experience if you don't help me? I've inquired about the Berkshire stations several times. Town Square doesn't want to sell them, at least not for a price that I want to pay. But we'll keep talking, hopefully. And I had become aware of these radio stations that I did acquire. I became aware of them 10 years ago. A gentleman by the name of John Garabedian, who's a legendary Boston radio talent. He's in the Radio Hall of Fame. He bought these stations piecemeal and put them together, and then he was also an engineer, but not by trade, but he loves the engineering side of the business, and it was really a hobby for him because he doesn't need the money. He's super rich, and he bought these radio stations, and then he went about configuring the signals, the radio signals, so that that he minimized the waste of the signal over water, so that these 4 radio stations cover the entire Cape and the islands, and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, and it really is a work of art how he did this with the signals and the antennas and the transmitters and the translators, and the 4 brands are strong brands. They're well known on the Cape. One of them is a rock station, WPXC, Pixie 103. It's 35 years as Cape Cod's rock, and then we have Y101, WHYA, which is a CHR station, which is for young people. We have Elvis Duran. We syndicate Elvis Duran from Z100 in New York in the mornings, and then the rest of the day is local. And then we have the most interesting name of a radio station, and I did not name it, is Frank FM. And Frank FM is a greatest hits of the 80s and 90s. And Frank is formatted to attract a woman between the ages of 34 and 44. And it does a great job of that.
Where did Frank come from? Where did
Truth be told, Frank was
ladies
created.
love Franks, I guess.
The name Frank FM was supposedly a shot at a gentleman who is a legendary broadcaster named Frank Osborne, who lives on the Cape, and they named it after him. I'm not sure if it was in respect or if it was as a joke, but Frank has been in existence for almost 10 years now.
Nice.
And then our last station is Coffee FM. WKFY.
I love that one.
Yeah, I know the way you drink coffee. But Coffee FM is an adult contemporary station, but it skews for adults 50 plus, which is perfect for the year-round residents of the Cape. And it really is. Our cell line is the soundtrack of Cape Cod, and it really is. It's interesting. Because we have people that will listen to Coffee and they'll also listen to Pixie, and which I can't imagine those two being on somebody's dial, button pushing between those two, but they do. And so, and the thing that attracted me, another thing that attracted me about the group back 6 years ago was its ability to reach the Cape Cod female from cradle to grave. And that's important because if you keep the female population engaged, the male population will follow in some degree. And they're also the main consumers. So you want to have, you want to have a significant hold on the female listenership, and then Pixie is the perfect combination to balance it out. So I'd met John Garabedian when I was at Westwood One, because John had done a network show called Saturday House Party, and he had that show for, I want to say 30 years, and we syndicated it. And I met John early on in my days at Westwood, because he came into New York to complain that he wasn't making enough money with his show, but we weren't selling it well enough. And I remember when my office manager came in and said, "Hey, John Garabedian wants to have lunch with you tomorrow." And I looked at her and I said, "Who's John Garabedian?" And she said, "Well, you syndicate his show." I'm like, "Oh," and I quickly had to learn and
do some research real quick.
Well, he and I became good friends, and he's got Berkshire roots. He loves the Berkshires. Has friends out here, and we just maintained a friendship. And I said one time I went out, I was on the Cape, and I called him up, and he says, come on down and let me show you the stations. And so I did. And when we were all done, I was like, oh my God. I said, if you ever want to sell these, let me know. And I kept going back to him, as you know, because I started telling you about this, 4 years ago.
It has been an odyssey for you.
And and his price was always way too high, and I wouldn't be able to make it work.
So there are radio standards for that. Like, what is the value of a radio station? So how does that work? Because people are like, oh, well, what's the value of a radio station? Well, you have a building, you have I guess a tower maybe that they own. There's a signal, there's equipment, but like how do you value a station?
Well, the most valuable thing that a radio station has right now is the FCC licenses. Because if you don't have the licenses, you can't make any money.
Right.
Because you can't run a radio station. That's a pirate radio station, and they'll shut you down.
Yeah.
But and you can't build your streaming platform off it. You can't build your websites unless you have the licenses. So the licenses are the most valuable thing. But how you value the price of a group is pretty much based on what's known as cash flow, which is another word for profit. And cash flow is the profit you make after you pay all your bills. And back in the day, radio stations were sold for 14, 15, sometimes 20 times cash flow. So if you're cash flowing $1 million, your price tag was 20 million if you want to buy this thing. Not only radio, but pretty much every traditional media platform, the matrix or the metrics for valuing the price has dropped. Nowadays, anything between 5 and 7 times cash flow is usually something you can make work. And John and I finally got to that magic window, and we were able to close the deal. And he was very complimentary. John is 80 years old, and he said to me, he goes, I've got to get my affairs in order. He doesn't have any heirs, and he said, it's time. And he said, and some of this was selling me though too. But he said,
he's good.
He said, I built these things. I'm proud of what I built, and I want to give them I want to hand them off to someone like you, because I built them. Now you can sell them. And so we did the deal, and we closed on November 30th, this past November 30th, which is the worst time to close on a radio station, because first quarter is the worst quarter of the year for media, because you're coming out of the holidays. It's funny. You get in there and it's like, oh my God, what did I do? But we're having a great year. And the other thing that really helped me is I knew radio was going to take off once the pandemic ended. And what really started the growth, and not just for radio, but for all media and for most businesses, was when they announced the vaccines, when the FDA approved the vaccines, because that started things opening up. And one thing that was good that I was fortunate, even though first quarter is really, really weak, is that if you remember last year, the vaccines were released in March. So last first quarter, we were still in the throes of the pandemic. So the growth would be huge. Mm-hmm. And it was. Mm-hmm. We ended first quarter up 45% over last year.
Big number.
And 29%. The last year that you can use as a metric for whether or not you're doing well is 2019. Mm-hmm. And we finished first quarter up 29% over 2019.
Amazing.
And 2019 was their best year ever as a group. So it's continuing on into the year. We're having a great second quarter. The Cape is just now starting to wake up. It's starting to come into the season of the Cape. And I applied the same, the same strategies that I've done everywhere else. The beautiful thing is that it's the first time that I've ever gone into managing something that wasn't a train wreck. And I had a better term for it, but I'll keep it clean. This group, the sales staff is strong. The on-air staff is strong. Everybody is focused. Everybody's into it. Everybody. John they're incredibly loyal. They were incredibly loyal to John. And one thing that they recognize is that I'm here to advance it. John had it basically as his hobby. And yeah, he loved it and he was dedicated to it, but he just wanted, he wasn't into, no, we're going to grow this thing. We're going to, and I'm into, as I said before, expanding into other content platforms, podcasts. We have to improve our stream. That is the one thing that it's hard to convince diehard radio people that this is where the audience is going.
Right.
Okay. You're not going to need an antenna in 10 years.
Yeah.
But if you don't pay attention to that, you're going to fail. So I've been like a maniac pushing the upgrade and improvement of our streams and our websites. And then the other thing is that just like I did in Detroit is we have really pushed the radio stations out into the community. We have done 4 blood drives already throughout the Cape, because I don't know how it is here in the Berkshires, but in the Cape, blood is scarce, and it's a real problem because of the pandemic, because people wouldn't go and donate blood. So we've done 4 blood drives already. We've got 4 more scheduled for the rest of the year. I just signed an exclusive agreement with the Falmouth Road Race.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, as you well know, as being a runner.
As you well know, and so it helps to bring your own sort of expertise. As you as a runner. I mean, Falmouth Road Race is a worldwide recognized event. 5th most recognizable road race in the world. Wow.
5th over things like the Berlin Marathon.
Yeah. A lot of marathons aren't as well known.
And we actually stole it from iHeart, because iHeart didn't do anything for them. And what people didn't realize, and I never realized, is that the money that the road race makes, they donate or they give as grants to nonprofits, and they give $250,000 of grants and scholarships. And the grants are to nonprofits, and scholarships are to high school seniors, non-athletic.
Yeah,
is how they award it based on what the student has done in a certain field, like science or math or history, and I just approached them and said, look, not only will we make this part of the fun of race day, and I quite honestly, I stole the idea from what we did. We did it at Clear Channel, where we had 5 radio stations in Manhattan, and we put them at strategic points of the New York Marathon. What we're going to do beginning this year is my 4 radio stations are going to be based at 4 strategic points in the Falmouth Road Race. We're going to have Coffee FM at the start, because coffee is soft and easy rock, and the runners are just hanging out, chilling in Woods Hole, and Woods Hole doesn't want all these people there. So hopefully the music will soothe the savage beast of the population of Woods Hole, who has to put up with all these runners in their little town. So that'll be at the start. At 3 miles, we're going to have Frank FM playing greatest hits of the 80s and 90s. At mile 5, we're going to have Y101, which is the young station, which is, build the energy even more. And at the finish, we'll have Pixie leading into the big party afterwards in the baseball field. But then what we're also doing is, and this is what won the day for us, is I've committed to doing features throughout the year on every student that gets a scholarship and on every nonprofit that gets a grant. We will feature and highlight what they're special, how special the students are, each individually, and then each nonprofit that is awarded a grant, what kind of work they're doing in the community.
Yeah, the great thing about radio. Okay, so you have your key moments, you have your drive times and everything, but you still have 24 hours of content to fill. That gives you a lot of opportunity. And then when you create that localized, really great content that means something to people, it doesn't have to just live on the air. Of course, you had now, and that's the beautiful thing about it. If you were, because you have those, how would you describe it? Where the content lives, like a lot of people say, okay, well, you're putting a video. Well, where does it live? Well, it lives on YouTube, and then you embed it and that sort of thing. Same thing here. Like, yeah, it goes out on the air at certain times, but like, you have that opportunity to have it live on your website and so forth, and it has value. So all that is really cool. And I was thinking also, like, they have those rock and roll marathons too.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if Falmouth does much of that. I mean, there's probably music playing, at the stations where they're set, but yeah, I mean, road races, again, there's a lot of steps between the start and the finish. There's a lot of road there that so I always love those rock and roll marathons. I think there's still one out there, or even there's a franchise of them. So those are all kinds of awesome things you can do out there.
Yeah. And then we also are doing a concert series every Wednesday night, in which we call it the Homegrown series. We have a show called Homegrown on Sunday nights, which is just about Cape Cod bands. And we're going to highlight another band each week. And we'll do that for 6 Wednesdays, beginning the first Wednesday after the 4th of July.
Man, you are cranking it out, man.
We got it.
You're just,
it makes a difference, and it wins people. And the other thing too, John, which I'll say, is the pandemic screwed up a lot of people, and the population of the Cape increased 24%. The year-round population increased 24% in the last 18 months, from people moving from Boston, New York, Hartford, and Providence, mostly. The locals, their routines were all ripped apart by the pandemic as well. Well, I've told my staff this over and over again. By my estimation, we have until probably September, October to get ourselves firmly entrenched in the new routines of not only those people who moved into the area, but the people who were here before that are now getting back to a regular life. So we've got to be out there. We've got to make ourselves, we're known, but we got to put ourselves out there. But more importantly is we got to make things work, and we got to engage the audience. We got to engage the audience. We got to engage the advertisers and make it all work. So that's why I've been like a full court press since December, putting a lot of miles on the car on the pike.
And you have a home in the Berkshires, and I want to be sensitive to your time, but I want to make sure that people know, hey, you have your Berkshire roots. I mean, you live here, but it didn't just come out of nowhere where, I'm going to live in the Berkshires. Well, you weren't born here, but you certainly had some formative years here in the Berkshires through high school, particularly.
Yeah, and that the Berkshires are truly the foundation of everything I've done. I mean, when we moved up here, I was 14. Yeah, going on 15. And in New Jersey, I was headed for trouble. I was. And we moved up here, and my first thought was, oh my God, this is awful. Because I'd come from right out, 15 minutes outside of Manhattan. And I got to tell you something. My experience in the Berkshires, it transformed me. And it was all about, quite honestly, a lot of it was the music. A lot of it was just the environment and the people. And I went to college in 1976. I left for college, and from the moment I left to the time till I got back here 2 years ago, my plan was to always get back here. And I wanted to I wanted to establish my business here, and I did. Now I just got to get some radio stations closer to the Berkshires.
It's all right. You set the foundation for it, right?
So, but yeah, no, I'm oh yeah. I think there's no better time for me anyway to get back here. And the interesting thing is a lot of people that were, kids when high school kids when I was in high school that have moved away or moving back.
Yeah.
I know half a dozen right now.
Yeah.
And
there are some good friends of yours who never left.
Some good friends who never left, who quite honestly, there are many times where I've said to them, you did it right, because you didn't have all the nonsense I had. But anyway,
it's good stuff. It's
It
good
is
stuff.
good.
Well, Steve, I'll keep following everything that's happening in the Cape. I hope that one day you do get a station or 3 or 4 or 5 here in the Berkshires. That would be fantastic.
I would love that.
I think it's amazing, the story that you had a lot of opportunities to kind of veer away that may have been maybe more income driven at the time or what have you, but you stayed true to your passion, and you're clearly happier for it.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's that's a powerful story.
Well, thanks. I hope it's engaging and entertaining. I don't know. It's
I love it. Always the judge.
What?
Will this will this do well in Peoria?
Yeah, I know. I like I said, compared to some of the people you've had on this podcast, this might be a bit of a snoozer. But
no, I think this is the best one. I think this is
come
the best
on.
One. So,
but anyway, but it's great. Thanks for having me, and I hope that I can make an impact here the way we have in other places, and we'll see. Keep listening.
Onward and upward.
Yeah.
Be
Cool.
well and best to your family.
Thanks, John. Ooh, boy.